The house at the end of the quiet cul-de-sac was picture perfect. It had a pristine lawn, freshly painted shutters, and a charming front porch that made it look like something straight out of a magazine. From the outside, the Walker family has it all: wealth, success, and stability. But inside those walls, a dark secret was festering, a secret that would lead to betrayal, forbidden desire, and a murder so shocking that it left an entire community reeling. It all started with a woman named Olivia Carter. Olivia had always dreamed of a life bigger than the one she was born into. She grew up in a small town, raised by a single mother who struggled to make ends meet. Determined to escape poverty, Olivia was always searching for a way out. And when she met Richard Walker, she thought she had found it. Richard was everything she had ever wanted: wealthy, charming, and most importantly, stable. He owned several businesses and lived in a luxurious home in an affluent neighborhood. He was 15 years older than her, but Olivia didn't care. She saw him as her ticket to the good life. At first, their marriage was everything Olivia had hoped for: extravagant vacations, expensive jewelry, and a life free from financial worries. But over time, reality set in. Richard was always busy, always working. Their marriage lacked passion, and Olivia began to feel more like a trophy wife than a love partner. And then Ethan came along. Ethan Walker was Richard's son from a previous marriage. He had spent most of his childhood living with his biological mother, only visiting his father occasionally. But when he turned 18, Richard insisted that he move in, hoping to repair their strained relationship before Ethan left for college. The moment Olivia saw him, something shifted inside her. Ethan was nothing like his father. He was young, strong, and full of life. His quiet confidence drew people in, and Olivia was no exception. At first, she told herself that it was just an innocent attraction, something any woman might feel. But the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore. It started with small things: a lingering glance across the dinner table, a touch that lasted a second too long, late-night conversations where they laughed and confided in each other in ways Olivia never had with Richard. She tried to fight it. She reminded herself that she was a stepmother, that this was wrong. But the heart wants what it wants. And one night, she gave in. It happened in the kitchen. Richard was away on a business trip, and Olivia had stayed up late, sipping wine. Ethan walked in, shirtless, fresh from a workout, and Olivia felt her resolve crumble. They talked, their voices hushed in the dim light, and before she knew it, she was kissing him. A single kiss. But it was enough to set everything in motion. From the moment Olivia and Ethan crossed that forbidden line, there was no turning back. The first kiss in the kitchen had been electric, filled with tension and reckless abandon. But what followed was even more dangerous, a slow, all-consuming affair that neither of them could resist. At first, they tried to convince themselves it was a mistake. The morning after, Olivia had avoided Ethan, barely able to meet his eyes as she made breakfast. She told herself that it had been the wine, that it had been loneliness, that it had been anything other than what it truly was: desire. Ethan, on the other hand, was intoxicated by it. He had never been with a woman like Olivia. She was experienced and confident, and she wanted him. It wasn't like the girls he had fooled around with in high school who giggled and blushed. Olivia was all fire and temptation, and Ethan wanted more, much more. It wasn't long before their secret turned into an addiction. Every moment alone became an opportunity. A stolen kiss in the hallway when Richard wasn't looking. Fingers brushing under the table at dinner. Whispered words in the dark that made Olivia's heart race. It was dangerous. It was exhilarating. And it was doomed to be discovered. They were careless, blinded by the heat of their affair. One afternoon, while Richard was at work, Olivia and Ethan met in the master bedroom, the very bed she shared with her husband. The thrill of it was almost too much to bear. But as they lay tangled together afterward, Ethan whispered, "I love you." Olivia stiffened. Love? This wasn't love. This was passion. This was lust. This was a game she was playing, one that made her feel young and powerful again. But Ethan didn't see it that way. To him, Olivia was everything. She wasn't just a stepmother. She was his escape, his obsession. "You don't have to stay with him," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "We could leave. Just us." Olivia forced a laugh, brushing his messy hair back. "And do what, Ethan? Run away and live in a cheap motel? What do you think would happen to us?" He didn't have an answer, but the seed had been planted. Ethan didn't just want her in secret. He wanted all of her. And that, Olivia realized, made him dangerous. While Olivia and Ethan were caught in their own world, someone else started to notice. Diane Lawson, their neighbor, had lived in the cul-de-sac for years, and she prided herself on knowing everything that happened. She had seen Olivia around town, always dressed perfectly, always polite but distant. But lately, something has changed. There was something in the way Olivia looked at Ethan, something that wasn't maternal. And Ethan, he was always hovering around her, always too close. Then one evening, Diane saw it. Through her window, she spotted Olivia and Ethan outside on the patio. Olivia had placed her hand on his chest, and Ethan had leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her face. It wasn't just affection. It was intimacy. Diane's stomach twisted. She didn't have proof, but she knew what she had seen. And in a neighborhood like this, secrets didn't stay buried for long. Oblivious to Diane's suspicions, Olivia and Ethan continued their affair. But the deeper they fell, the more complicated things became. Ethan was no longer content with secrecy. He became jealous when Richard kissed Olivia goodbye before work. He clenched his fists when Richard rested a hand on her lower back at dinner. And one night, when Richard kissed Olivia on the forehead, Ethan stormed out of the house. Olivia found him outside, pacing, his fists clenched. "This isn't fair," Ethan snapped. "I hate seeing him touch you." Olivia's stomach twisted. This was spiraling out of control. She had told herself that Ethan was just a phase, a distraction. But now it was clear. He was falling apart. She needed to end it. But before she could, something happened that changed everything. She missed her period. Her hands trembled as she held the pregnancy test, staring at the 2 pink lines. Her heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was a disaster waiting to explode. The first sign was subtle. Olivia had always been meticulous about her cycle, and when her period was late, a flicker of anxiety settled in the back of her mind. At first, she dismissed it. Stress, maybe. She'd been under a lot of pressure, after all. Juggling a marriage, an affair, and the constant fear of being caught was enough to throw anyone off balance. But as the days passed, her anxiety grew. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Her body felt different, more sluggish, her emotions more erratic. She felt nauseous in the mornings and dizzy when she stood too quickly. Deep down, she already knew the truth. Still, she needed confirmation. One afternoon, while Richard was at work and Ethan was out, Olivia drove to a pharmacy 2 towns over, where no one would recognize her. She walked through the aisles, her hands clammy, her pulse racing as she grabbed a pregnancy test and tossed it into her basket. By the time she got home, her hands were trembling so badly that she nearly dropped the test on the bathroom floor. She locked the door, took a deep breath and waited. Seconds felt like hours. Then, 2 pink lines. Positive. Her stomach clenched, and for the first time in her life, Olivia felt true, unshakable terror. She took another test, then another, all positive. There was no denying it. She was pregnant, and there was no way it was Richard's. Her heart pounded as the realization crashed over her. This wasn't just a mistake she could cover up. This was a ticking time bomb. Richard had never been an affectionate husband, but he was possessive. He valued control over everything, including her. If he found out, he wouldn't just leave her. He would destroy her. He had the money, the power, the influence. He could take everything, her home, her lifestyle, her dignity. And if he suspected Ethan, Olivia squeezed her eyes shut. She had seen Richard's temper before, in the way he crushed people who crossed him in business, in the way his voice turned cold and sharp when things didn't go his way. If he found out that his own son had betrayed him like this, there would be no mercy. But what terrified Olivia the most wasn't Richard. It was Ethan. She knew she had to tell him. That night, while Richard was out at a business dinner, Olivia found Ethan in his room. He was lying on his bed, flipping through his phone, but when he saw her standing in the doorway, his face lit up. He didn't even wait for her to speak. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her like she was the only thing that mattered. She pulled away, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant." Ethan froze. For a moment, he just stared at her, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. Then his lips parted, and to Olivia's shock, a slow, excited smile spread across his face. "Are you serious?" he breathed. She nodded, her throat tight. Ethan grabbed her hands. "This is amazing." Amazing? Olivia blinked at him. How could he possibly think this was amazing? Ethan was only 18. Barely a man, barely capable of taking care of himself, let alone a child. He had no job, no money, no stability. And yet he looked at her like this was the best thing that had ever happened to him. "This is our chance," he said, his grip tightening. "We can finally be together. We don't have to hide anymore." Olivia's mouth went dry. She had been expecting fear, anger, maybe even denial. But not this. Ethan wasn't scared at all. He was hopeful. He thought this baby meant they could have a life together, that they could run away, start fresh, and build a family. But Olivia knew better. They weren't fighting for love. They were fighting for survival. And if they wanted to survive, there was only one option. Richard had to go. The decision wasn't made overnight. At first, Olivia tried to convince herself that there had to be another way. Maybe she could fake a miscarriage. Maybe she could persuade Richard that the baby was his, that a fluke of genetics made the child look different. Maybe, just maybe, she and Ethan could disappear before anyone figured it out. But deep down, she knew none of that would work. Richard was too smart, too controlling, too ruthless. He would suspect, and once he did, there would be no stopping him. Olivia had spent years watching her husband crush his business rivals and destroy those who got in his way. He didn't just eliminate threats. He made examples of them. If he ever learned the truth, he would ensure she ended up with nothing. And Ethan? Richard wouldn't just disown him. He would ruin him. Olivia couldn't let that happen. She had to protect herself. She had to protect Ethan. And that meant Richard had to die. The first step was making it look natural. Olivia started small. She began slipping sleeping pills into Richard's evening glass of wine, just enough to make him drowsy and sluggish. She did it over weeks, making sure his fatigue became something expected, something explainable. "You should see a doctor," she suggested one night, her voice full of concern. "You've been so exhausted lately." Richard had waved her off. "I'm fine. Just work stress." That was exactly what she needed him to think. Every night, she increased the dose, a little at a time. By the time she was ready to put their plan into motion, Richard's body had already adjusted to the medication. He would never suspect that tonight's dose was lethal. It was raining that night. The storm outside cast eerie shadows against the walls, the occasional crack of thunder making Olivia flinch. She had poured Richard his usual glass of wine, stirring in the final dose, enough to put him into a deep, unshakable sleep. When he finally drifted off in his recliner, his chest rising and falling in slow, even breaths, Olivia turned to Ethan. Now, Ethan hesitated. This was different from what they had been doing before. The stolen kisses, the whispered promises, the reckless passion. It had all been thrilling. But this was real. This was murder. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the rain pounding against the windows. Olivia's jaw tightened. "It's the only way." She pressed the pillow into his hands, her fingers digging into his skin. "Do it." Ethan's hands trembled as he stepped forward. staring down at his sleeping father. He had always resented Richard, always felt like he was never good enough in his eyes. But did he really have it in him to kill the man who raised him? Richard stirred slightly, and Olivia stiffened. There could be no hesitation. Ethan took a deep breath, then pressed the pillow over Richard's face. The struggle was brief. Richard's arms flailed weakly at first, but his drugged body was too slow, too sluggish. Within seconds, his movements became frantic, his legs jerking, his fingers clawing at the armrests. A muffled, choking sound filled the air, followed by a final, desperate gasp. And then silence. The storm raged on outside, but inside, everything was still. Richard Walker was dead. Olivia took a step back, her pulse pounding so hard she thought she might pass out. Ethan was frozen, staring at his father's lifeless body, his breathing ragged. "It's done," Olivia whispered, more to herself than to him. She turned on her heel, rushing to the phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. When the operator answered, Olivia let out a blood-curdling sob. "My husband, he's not breathing," she wailed. "Oh my God, I think he had a heart attack." The paramedics arrived within minutes. Olivia played her part flawlessly, hysterical, devastated, clinging to Ethan like a grieving widow clings to hope. The lead paramedic, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, examined Richard's body and then sighed. "Looks like a cardiac arrest," he murmured to his team. "He's got a history of fatigue, right?" Olivia nodded frantically, wiping away fake tears. Yes. He's been exhausted for weeks. He kept saying it was just stress, but I should have forced him to see a doctor. I should have done something." The paramedic patted her shoulder, offering what he thought was comfort. "There's nothing you could have done, ma'am. No autopsy was deemed necessary. The case was closed before it even began. Olivia and Ethan had won, or so they thought." For the first few weeks after Richard's death, Olivia and Ethan lived in a bubble of relief. The plan had worked flawlessly. No suspicions, no investigations, just the quiet hum of condolences from friends and acquaintances, murmuring about how tragic it was that Richard had died so young. Olivia played the grieving widow perfectly. She dressed in black, let her makeup smudge just enough to make it look like she had been crying, and accepted sympathy with a hollow, broken look in her eyes. Ethan, too, played his part, though not as convincingly. He had never been a good liar, and sometimes Olivia would catch him looking too relaxed, too free, as if the weight of his father had been lifted off him. But while they had fooled the world, they hadn't fooled themselves. The paranoia set in quickly. It started small. Olivia began noticing the way Ethan stared at her, not with the same burning desire as before, but with something else, something she couldn't quite place. He was clingy, desperate for her affection in a way that made her uneasy. He wanted constant reassurance that they had done the right thing, that this was for them, that their love had been worth it. But Olivia had changed. The moment Richard took his last breath, something inside her shifted. The thrill of the affair was gone. The danger, the secrecy, the risk. It had all made Ethan feel intoxicated. But now he was just an 18-year-old boy who had done something terrible for her. And Olivia, she had what she wanted. Freedom, money, control. Ethan, once the center of her world, was now an anchor dragging her down. And then there was Diane. Nosy, relentless Diane Lawson, who had always had her doubts about Olivia. Something about Richard's sudden death didn't sit right with her. She had seen too much. Olivia and Ethan's stolen glances, the way their bodies gravitated toward each other. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. And then, barely a month after Richard's death, Diane saw something that confirmed her worst fears. One evening, as she took out her trash, she noticed Olivia and Ethan on the back patio. Olivia was laughing at something Ethan had said, her hand playfully swatting at his chest. And Ethan, he leaned in too close, his hands resting on her waist. Diane's breath caught in her throat. That wasn't grief. That was something else. She didn't have solid proof, just a sick feeling in her gut. But it was enough. The next morning, she made an anonymous call to the police. The first sign of trouble came when the police showed up at Olivia's house, asking routine follow-up questions. Olivia kept her composure, answering every question with well-rehearsed ease. Yes, Richard had been stressed. No, she hadn't noticed anything unusual the night he died. No, she didn't think an autopsy was necessary at the time. After all, he had been complaining of exhaustion for weeks. It should have ended there. But then, they exhumed Richard's body. Toxicology tests revealed the sedatives. And though the initial assumption had been a heart attack, the bruising around his face suggested otherwise. It wasn't definitive proof of murder, but it was enough to bring Olivia and Ethan in for questioning. And that was all it took. They were separated immediately. Olivia was cold, calculated, and confident. She had been preparing for this moment. But Ethan was young, scared, and completely unprepared. The detectives didn't even have to push him hard. They just let the silence sit, let the weight of what he had done settle on his shoulders. Then they told him Olivia was already talking. And that was it. Ethan cracked. He confessed everything. The affair, the pregnancy, the plan to kill Richard. Every ugly detail spilled from his lips in a flood of guilt and regret. When Olivia found out he had confessed, she turned on him instantly. "He's lying," she told the investigators. "I never wanted any of this. Ethan was obsessed with me. He pressured me. He forced me into this." But it was too late. The truth was out. She tried to play the victim in court, painting Ethan as the manipulative one, a troubled young man who had seduced her and then taken things too far. But the jury saw through her lies. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Ethan, though just as guilty, was shown some leniency due to his age and Olivia's influence over him. He was given 25 years. And the baby, born behind bars, taken into foster care. As Olivia sat in her prison cell, staring at the cold, gray walls, she realized the bitter truth. She had done it all for a future that no longer existed. The passion, the thrill, the fantasy of being with Ethan, it had all evaporated the moment Richard died. And now, she had nothing. No money, no freedom, no love. Just a lifetime to think about the moment everything fell apart.